Hello and thank you for watching the Angry Rooster Creations channel. Today we have another fountain pen related video. We are going to be doing a test of these four samples of the Atramentis Document inks. We have the Document Red, the Document Dark Red, the Document Purple Violet, and Document Fuchsia. These inks are inks that are pigmented, permanent inks. These are kind of very well known for being a permanent ink. In fact, I do believe that these are ISO certified, have met this testing criteria to be ISO certified as document inks. So they've actually got a little bit more behind them than some other inks as far as claims to permanence. But today we're going to be testing these on 4 papers. That's going to be a 20-pound copy paper as a sort of control, a 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper, a 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper, and a 98-pound Canson mixed media paper. And after that, I'm also going to be doing a quick water test with these inks. And as for our pens for today, I've got 2 of these Jinhao 619 pens that have extra fine nibs, and I've got 2 Jinhao 992 pens that also have extra fine nibs. Alright, and so without further ado, let's get on to the writing test on the 20-pound copy paper. And here we are with the 20-pound copy paper. Alright, and that's going to conclude the test with the 20-pound copy paper. Now, honestly, the red seemed to work out alright. I don't really see a whole lot of feathering or any kind of negative effects of the ink on the front of the paper here. The dark red, there's a couple spots in it. It's right out here at the end of the nib. I don't even know if that's going to show on the camera. It probably won't. Where it looks like maybe there's a little bit where it's wanting to feather. But there is some spots on the purple, like in the E, on the end of DE here. If we come out to the end, lower on the print EF, they sort of grew and feathered a bit on the page. And then the document Fuchsia probably feathered the most. It's a little bit on the T there, I don't know if that's going to show. And there's a lot of smaller feathers. Yeah, that's showing up on camera. And the word fuchsia, both in the print and Fuchsia, how I spelled it on the cursive there, incorrectly. You can see that there's some feathers, and also on the EF down here, especially on the print EF. So, out of the 4 inks on the front of the page, the Fuchsia seemed to perform not the best. Now, for the dry times, looks like really nothing more than 4 seconds at the maximum. And most of them look like they've dried within 2. Looks like 1 second on the purple, 2 on the fuchsia. About 4 seconds on the 2 reds. Maybe more like 3 on the document. There'd be some slight smearing, but these dried pretty quick compared to the other pigmented inks that I've tested so far. As far as the back of the page, they're all ghosting pretty good. They're not, I think the red seemed to ghost the least, but they all have some ghosting. Nothing that, like, there's no bleeds that bled through and would have bled completely through the page, but definitely some ghosting here. Some of these, like the purple and the fuchsia, are ghosting enough that I would say you might start to get to a point where there may be some issues using the back side of the paper. If you were writing on this paper with those two inks. The two reds don't seem to be quite as aggressive. Definitely not the worst performing inks that I've seen on copy paper, but also not necessarily the best. But for what these inks are really meant for, these permanent pigmented inks, copy paper is not the likely paper you're probably going to be using these inks on. And so with that being said, now we're going to move on to the next test, which is the Blick 50-pound white sulfite drawing paper. And here we are with the 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper. Alright, and that concludes the writing test on the 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper. Now, on this paper, I don't really see any feathering or anything of that sort on any of the inks. It looks like they all handled quite well on this paper. Now, I maybe am starting to see some shading beginning with this paper. A little bit in the red, not a whole lot. On a couple of the T's, the dark red is pretty much monotone for the most part. Maybe a little bit darker on the 9 there. I don't know if this is going to show up. Probably isn't. It's mostly monotone. The only place I'm really seeing standout shading is in the violet. Pretty sure this is going to show here. You can see spots in that purple violet. And I say purple violet because there is another violet. I think there's a red violet and a purple violet. If I remember correctly, there are a lot of different colors in this series of inks. But you can definitely see the E there on the print document. That E is substantially darker. That T has some shading. And then the E and F down here, there's definitive shading that can be seen on E and F. And on the fuchsia here, actually, it is mostly monotone. I think a few places, the E and F down here, I can see some shading, but it's fairly monotone through most of the writing on the fuchsia. Now, dry times here, these stayed pretty wet pretty long. Looks like it was wet for 6 seconds on the red, still wet after 10 seconds on the dark red. Looks like we're still red at 8 seconds on the purple violet and wet at 10 seconds on the fuchsia there. And there is no real ghosting or any kind of show through anywhere on this. I did not expect there to be. This is a 50-pound paper, and while it is the most absorbent of the 3 art papers I'll be testing today, it is less absorbent than copy paper. So that concludes the test on the 50-pound white sulfite drawing paper. Our next paper is going to be the Koh-i-Noor 50-pound sketch paper. And here is the 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. Alright, and that's going to conclude the writing on the Koh-i-Noor 50-pound sketch paper. Now, there is not going to be any kind of feathering or any other type of negative effects on the front of this paper. I mean, I can just hold it up and look at that, and I've known this because every ink that I put on this paper has performed excellent on this paper. This paper is very ink friendly. Now, as far as dry times, it looks like all of them were still wet, even at the 10-second mark on the smear. So over, at the minimum 10 seconds to dry, potentially over 10 seconds to dry on this paper. This is not a very absorbent paper at all. And I do see more shading here. Once again, it's kind of hard to pick it up in the red. It's there, but it's not super duper prominent. You can see, it may not show on the camera, but I can see it to the naked eye. There's a little bit there. The dark red is still very much monotone. Not really much to speak of in terms of shading. The purple violet here, though, I don't know. Let's see. This should show up. The T's on Atramentis there, the A there, the end of the E here. The T there on violet, the top of that V, that leg on violet. The J there in Jinhao, the H in Jinhao on the print. And the TH on with. The E and the F, you can definitely see it. I mean, it's all over it. The purple is a shading ink. 100% it shades. And the fuchsia, there is some, you can see some. The E and F down here is where it's probably the most prominent, but it's not, a lot of it looks pretty monotone. So I wouldn't really consider it to be a very shade-prone ink. That E there, certain strokes you can get some shading, but it's not, it doesn't seem to be consistently wanting to shade. For the most part, it's kind of wanting to be monotone, more like the two reds there. And as far as the back of the page, there's not going to be anything. I have never really had an ink that, even the most aggressive inks I've tried, have not ghosted, or definitely none of them have ever bled on this page. This is a very thin paper for a 50-pound paper. It feels almost like a parchment paper, but it is very resistant to inks, and therefore I've never had an ink bleed through it. So that concludes the test of the Koh-i-Noor paper. The next one is going to be the Canson 98-pound mixed media paper. And now here we are with the 98-pound Canson mixed media paper. Alright, and that's going to conclude the test for the Canson 98-pound mixed media paper. And once again, like with the Blick, I did not expect to see any kind of adverse reactions on this paper, no kind of feathers or anything. This is a mixed media paper. It's meant for not only ink, but other types of more aggressive wet media, such as, other types of inks, including alcohol inks and things, and watercolors to an extent, not with really super heavy page saturating washes, but it can tolerate and handle watercolors. So it's not a very absorbent paper, and I didn't expect to see any kind of featherings or things on this paper. Now, with this being the least absorbent of all four papers, I am starting to see some more noticeable shading in the red here. Still not a whole lot. The T there, an Atramentis, the bottom of the R here in this red. The E and the F there, and parts of with, the 9. There's a few places. Still, you gotta really look for it. It is mostly monotone. The dark red, I see one little bit of shading where the T's are crossed, and that's only because one ink line crossed another ink line. Other than that, it's still fairly monotone, maybe just a little bit in the E and the F. The B here on nib. Not much. It's pretty monotone. Purple, once again, showing that it is definitely a shading ink. The T's there. The A and T, the E's at the end of both of those D on D Atramentis. Top of the V on violet. Both the T's here. Pretty much most of the ends of the pen strokes are darker. I mean, just all over. The E and the F definitely here. That purple violet is a shading ink, 100%. And then when we get to the the Fuchsia, disregard my flub there, and writing over things. Same thing here, I kind of doubled over the line. And there's a few places where it looks like it wants to shade a little bit. E and F here definitely. But for the most part, and most of it, it's fairly monotone. It's not shading a whole lot, but there is some there. Now, as far as the dry time, the regular red here looks like it's the least smear prone. It still looks like it's smeared at least to 9 seconds. The other three, though, looks like they were still, the document red definitely still wet at 10 seconds. Looks like we got a little bit of a smear going at 10 seconds on the document purple violet, but for sure about 7 seconds it's still wet, and still wet at 10 seconds on the Fuchsia. And there's not going to be any bleed through on this. I have never had an ink whatsoever bleed through this. Like I said, this is, not only does it say 98-pound paper, so it's cardstock weight paper, but it's specifically a non-absorbent paper because it's made to use as a mixed media, which includes a lot of, like I said, very wet media. So I didn't expect any kind of bleed through that. Holds up perfectly fine on this paper, and no surprises here from me. So that's going to conclude the test with our 98-pound Canson mixed media paper. Now, before we move on to the last test, which is going to be the water test, I really quickly want to show some chromatographies that I did, or sort of attempted to do with these inks. Now, these are done on some white coffee filter paper. It was, a line of ink was put down and immediately dipped into a mixture of 70% isopropyl alcohol and water, mixed at a roughly 1/3 solution. And as you can see, none of these inks really moved all that much. You had a lot of that pigment really want to bind in that initial line, and some of it moved up, but very, very little. And it's not just on the one. In fact, here on the dark red, part of the line didn't even move. It already had dried before I even got this paper into the water and alcohol solution. Same thing on the violet, and same thing on the Fuchsia. And like these are, this makes a total of 12 pigmented inks that I've tested so far from 3 different brands. But pretty consistently with all the pigmented inks and the chromatographies, you have one pigment that is responsible for making up the color of that ink. And so there's not really, multiple colors in the chromatography. It's just essentially the same color that gets lighter as it wicks up the filter paper. And in this case, there wasn't a whole lot of wicking, there wasn't a whole lot of movement, so you're not seeing a whole lot here, but it's consistently, there is one component, essentially it looks like, that is responsible for giving the ink its color. It's not made up of multiple colors and multiple component bits. So, there you go. And this also leads me to believe that we're going to be very much water resistant in the next test. So let's move on to that one. And now for our last test, we're going to do a quick water resistance test. I am going to take the pen. I'm going to draw a little grid square on here. As you can see, I've already done with a few other inks. I'm going to then wait 30 seconds, timed with a stopwatch. And after those 30 seconds, I'm going to take this pipette, I'm going to drip some water on that little grid square, wait another 10 seconds, rub the water around to see if I can get it to move on the page, and then dab the water off with this paper towel to see if any ink lifts. Alright, so alright, so I do actually think that I got 2 of them to move slightly. Not very much. I don't know if this is going to show up. So this is from when I blotted the purple. It probably just looks like a wet spot, but I can definitely tell that there is a little faint bit of purple here. And I could see the purple in the water when I was swirling it around. And the same thing, here's a little bit of the fuchsia. Like I said, I don't know that this is going to show up on the camera or not. There's just a hair bit there, just very faint, not a lot. I feel like, now of course it's still wet, so it's going to be hard to tell, but I feel like on the purple I can see a little bit where it kind of moved. Not very much, but just a little bit. If this was to fully dry, I think you would see a little bit, not much. And I can't really see where anything moved on the fuchsia. I just saw it in the water and just slightly on the towel. Now, once again, this is a 20-pound copy paper. And once again, I only let this sit for 30 seconds. So if you were going to use these, and this is just general rule of thumb in my personal opinion, if you're going to use any kind of ink and then go over it with any sort of wet media, even if it's a waterproof or water-resistant ink, I would suggest leaving it for a few hours, if not a day or so. That can depend on the ink, this type of ink. These, after several minutes should be pretty dry because they are a pigment ink and they use a binder to bind a pigment to the paper. So they should have a shorter dry time than, say, cellulose reactive inks, like what Noodler's makes, which have to chemically bond to a paper to attain permanence. So, but on some of these, at least with the purple and the fuchsia, seems like 30 seconds is not quite long enough of a wait time for these to dry. The two reds, though, I can't really see that they moved, and I didn't really see the water change color. So those seem to dry and set pretty quick. These two maybe take a little bit more time. But overall, very, very water resistant, and I would say waterproof with these inks. If you... and this was, I dripped a lot of water on there, let it sit, and I rubbed it in. You were in a position where you just spilled a little bit of water or something on it. I don't think you're going to have an issue with your writings or drawings just washing away off the paper. So, with all that having been said, so far, they seem to work pretty well. Now, of the only thing is with the copy paper, which for a permanent pigmented ink, I don't think that you're primarily going to be using inks like this on copy paper. But on the copy paper, compared to the other two brands of pigmented inks that I've tried, that being Octopus Fluids Write and Draw and Diamine's Forever inks, these seem to perform the least acceptable. And it wasn't with all of them, but on some of them, like the Document Fuchsia, a little bit on the Document Purple Violet, they kind of wanted to feather a bit. But all in all, for the rest of the paper, seem to work just fine. They seem to be water resistant, as they're advertised to be, which I've watched videos on these inks, on the Document series inks. I pretty much expected that to be the case. And these are kind of well-known, well-established inks, I would say. These have been around for quite a while, and like I said earlier, I do believe, if I'm not mistaken, that these are actually carry an ISO certification and have been tested, or at least have been tested to ISO standards to use as a document ink. So, that includes water resistance, but that also includes light fastness. Now, on light fastness, I do plan on making a test with the papers that I wrote on today and doing a light fastness test where I'm going to take those papers, I'm going to cut them in half with a paper cutter. One half of those sheets I'm going to put in a manila envelope or manila folder and stick it up on my shelf, protected from any kind of light exposure. And the other half of those papers I'm going to tape up in a window on the south side of my house in direct view of the sun and leave it there with direct sunlight exposure for a whole month. And we're going to see if these inks fade, and the other pigmented inks that I tested recently are also going to be tested at the same time. So that will be in a future video. But as for this video, that's pretty much going to do it for these inks. Now, you know, my interest in these inks is because I like to draw and I like to do artwork. And so permanence of ink for pens is quite important for what I do with ink. So that's why I tend to look for inks like these, or like the Noodler's cellulose reactive inks. So I have a preference toward these types of inks, particularly in inks that are labeled, listed, or otherwise promoted as being light fast or fade resistant. Because if you display an art piece, it's going to get exposed to light more than, say, writings in a journal, or, you know, a diary or notebook, etc., where you're going to close it and then store it on a shelf or something. So light fastness becomes a very important property. Now, I will say that there are generally quirks anytime that you have a permanent ink, and with these being pigmented inks, the biggest quirk is going to be you do not want to leave a pigmented ink sitting in a pen that is not being used. So if you're going to use a pigmented ink, you want to make sure it's in a pen that you regularly use. You want to make sure that it's in a pen that has a good cap seal, that is not prone to dry out. And you also probably don't want to put it in a very valuable pen. That is because pigmented inks, if they dry in your pen, the binder agent, you know, the binder chemical or agent in these pens, in these inks, will cause that those pigments to solidify in your pen, specifically in the feed, like in your feed channels, and they can potentially be a situation where you cannot clean that feed out, and it will permanently damage the pen. Now, I can say I've had these samples here actually for quite a while, since before I was doing YouTube videos. And I tested these Atramentis Document ink samples. And one of these Genhouse 619s that I have, it's this orange one. I believe this one had the Document dark red in it. At the time, I did not realize that these pens had a faulty cap seal. And several of these pens dried out. And when I say they dried out, I mean within a week they dried out. And it pretty much killed this pen. I was able to take this apart and I tried to clean it up, but I couldn't get all that crust out of the crusted up ink out of the feed and out of the feed channels. And it led to this pen essentially having permanent flow issues. Now, the main reason I keep this one, it's kind of a boneyard pen. It's spare parts to kind of keep the other 619s going if I need to, minus the feed. The feed on that one is toast. So if you're going to store a pen, or you're going to have a pen that has one of these pigmented inks in it, you're not going to use it for a while. You need to go ahead and empty it out and then flush it out real good to make sure there's no ink left in it, because you don't want a pigmented ink drying in your pen. And that's not with just these document ink, these Atramentis inks, that's any pigmented ink. You don't want to leave them in a pen for extended periods. So, that's just something to be aware of. But other than that, if you understand the maintenance and upkeep that needs to go with using a pigmented ink, and you're looking for the permanent qualities that these inks give you, these are a good option. And like I said, these are a kind of well-known, well-established ink for being permanent inks. And so that's going to do it for this video. If you've watched this long, watched through the entire video, I thank you for watching this. I know my videos are a bit long-winded a lot of times, especially these. If you liked what you saw, you liked the way I tried to present the information, I'd appreciate a thumbs up down there. That'd really help me. And if you've watched this video, maybe you've watched some of my other videos, you kind of like the way I try to present my information, you like the way I do my videos, then I would appreciate a subscription, because that would also help me out. And that's going to do it for this episode. I thank you for watching, and I hope to catch you on the next one. Bye.